But we start with the first public hearing of the January 6th Select Committee, which is set to have televised prime time hearings starting next Thursday. The bipartisan panel has interviewed over 1,000 people and received tens of thousands of pages of documents as it investigates coordinated attempts by the former president and his allies to overturn our presidential election in an attack on our democracy that culminated in a deadly insurrection. We've talked a lot on this show about how close we actually came to losing our democracy that day and how the threat to our democracy isn't over, but is in fact growing with Republican efforts to suppress voting and subvert future elections. But a key question is whether this committee and their hearings will be able to break through the noise and get Americans' attention. In the Watergate scandal, 71% of Americans reported watching the congressional hearings. The January 6th Select Committee is unlikely to get that many viewers in today's really polarized and fragmented media environment, but can it get enough Americans to pay attention to understand what's at stake here? Here to break all of this down ahead of next week's hearings, Melissa Murray, a law professor at New York University, and Glenn Kirshner, an MSNBC legal analyst and former federal prosecutor. Okay, perfect people to have here today. Glenn, I'll start with you. What story do Democrats need to tell through these primetime hearings?
You know, what they need to do, Zerlina, is put on a presentation that kind of appeals to everybody across the spectrum, not unlike when we're trying criminal cases. You're going to have 12 people in a jury box, you know, and they're going to range from a high school dropout to a scientist and everybody in between. And what we need to do is put on a common sense, compelling, vivid presentation, not to a jury, but to the American people, that really drives home what Donald Trump and his many criminal associates did in trying to overturn the results of a presidential election, and you know what the evidence is that has been amassed by the January 6th Select Committee proving what Donald Trump is. And you know, the J6 Committee's mandate is to, one, see what kind of legislation should be enacted to make sure this never happens again, and two, make criminal referrals of Donald Trump and anybody else if the evidence supports that they committed crimes.
Melissa, essentially the same question to you, but one of the things I think a lot about is why the Mueller report didn't result in more accountability for folks involved in some of the facts laid out there. And part of the problem was there wasn't, to Glenn's point, that evidence. There wasn't a lot of proof. In this case, we have 1,000 witnesses and thousands of pages of documentation and some critical witnesses that can provide that evidence to fill in some of the questions around what Donald Trump was doing during the insurrection, for example. So same question with the caveat of where do you think, given that amass of information, the committee should focus Americans' attention?
So I will say one critical difference between this and the Mueller report is that this is going to be playing out on television in prime time, as opposed to being asked to read a multi-hundred-page document or to listen to incredibly arcane and nuanced legal testimony from a lawyer like Robert Mueller. And so I think Glenn is exactly right. This is about plain-spoken, common-sense approaches to putting together what is actually a quite sprawling and disparate case. I mean, they need to show that this is not two disembodied events, what happened at the Capitol and then what was happening in the Oval Office, but that this was an entire enterprise that was rotten at the core, and the rot began at the head. And what we saw play out at the Capitol was merely a manifestation of what the president and his associates were orchestrating. And to be really clear for the American public, that threat has not abated. The Capitol insurrection is over, but the threat persists, and it's a fundamental existential threat to democracy.
Glenn, a former Trump aide, Peter Navarro, has now been officially indicted for contempt of Congress for defying a subpoena from the committee. What's your reaction to this news as we are a week away from these public hearings?
Yeah, on the criminal referral for contempt of Congress front, it looks like it's 2 down and 2 to go, because the Congress has referred 4 people, I think at last count, for prosecution for contempt of Congress, for just defying lawfully issued congressional subpoenas. And now we know both Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro are indicted for their crimes, and Mark Meadows and Dan Scavino have been referred but are not yet indicted. And of course, Peter Navarro, he of the Green Bay sweep, which he loves to invoke all the time. That's a page from his playbook. Let me take another page out of the playbook. Yesterday, Peter Navarro was scheduled to appear before the grand jury and was directed to provide all information about his communications with Donald Trump, which leads to the only reasonable conclusion that the grand jury is criminally investigating Donald Trump. And today, after that scheduled grand jury appearance yesterday, he gets criminally indicted. That is actually a standard play from the prosecutorial playbook. It looks like they tried to meet with him yesterday, maybe bring him on board, offer him a plea deal. Maybe he said no, so today he stands indicted. And you can bet they will continue to work on him to try to get him to stop covering up Donald Trump's crimes, come on board, take responsibility for his own conduct, and then testify about the crimes of others.
And Melissa, one of the other people involved that, allegedly spoke to the president on the day of the insurrection during the attack on the Capitol, Congressman Jim Jordan. He's also refused to comply with a subpoena from the committee, and they have warned him he has until June 11th to cooperate. Like, he has a deadline, and so it's put up or shut up. Is it possible, you think, that he could also be indicted for contempt if he doesn't comply with this lawful subpoena?
So again, this is a more, I think, nuanced question. We haven't necessarily had a situation where a sitting member of Congress has been held in contempt of that body. So this would be uncharted water to some extent. But again, it's not the committee's decision about whether or not Jim Jordan would be indicted. They refer that matter to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice ultimately makes the decision about how they will proceed. But again, I think the committee is making very clear that they're not going to tolerate this kind of recalcitrance. It's an obstruction of the committee's role in providing oversight and trying to determine not only what happened on January 6th and what came before it, but also how to prevent what happened from happening again.
It's important to understand that obstruction piece, because that was one of the through lines in the Mueller report. Because witnesses weren't cooperating, they weren't able to get to the bottom of a lot of the facts alleged. Glenn, I want to pivot a bit to another investigation that's happening that's really, really important, which is what's happening in Georgia. So the Georgia investigation into whether Donald Trump interfered in the election with the call that we've all heard on the phone with Donald Trump and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. Raffensperger actually testified before the special grand jury down in Georgia this week. Is it possible, you think, Glenn, that Trump could be indicted in Georgia? I mean, put all of the January 6th stuff aside, this other case is always percolating in the background.
Yeah, I would say he can be indicted in Georgia, and he should be indicted in Georgia, because we basically have all of the evidence we need on that recorded phone call with Brad Raffensperger. And you know what? Brad Raffensperger behaved the way a law-abiding politician should. He complied with the subpoena. He went into the grand jury. He reportedly testified for 5 hours. And I couldn't agree more with Professor Murray when she says so many of these things represent uncharted waters. But you know what? We have to take these maiden legal voyages so we can get some law on, for example, whether Congress can hold in contempt and refer for prosecution one of its own for violating the rules of Congress, violating a lawfully issued subpoena. I would say the same would hold true for corruptly delivered pardons by a president. We have to take these maiden legal voyages so we can bubble them up to an appellate court and get some law so we know how to address these problems in the future if they recur.
I really hope we don't have to utilize those that new law created for future insurrections, but it's a really important point. Professor Melissa Murray and Glenn Kirschner, thank you so much for starting us off. Please stay safe. Hi, I'm Zerlina Maxwell. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more from Zerlina by clicking any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thanks for watching.